Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Harvey Mansfield. This is a program sponsored by the Program on Constitutional Government in the Great Green Government Department of Harvard University, where we all presently sit. And our subject today is Machiavelli's The Prince on its 500th anniversary. I propose as the theme for our discussions, never insistent, but perhaps occasionally referred to, the greatness of Machiavelli. What does that consist in? Certainly an author and a book that are read by every educated person after half a millennia is a sign of greatness. Another sign is the fact that Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy has as its first word, io, and as its last word, massimo, greatest. And of course, the Massimo is attached to Fabius, but maybe that's another sign of for us to explore as well. So I won't go further, but just introduce the speakers on our first panel, which is Machiavelli a Philosopher? The introduction will consist of giving their names, their home base, and the college mascot. So we're starting out with Ioannis. Evrigenis is from the Jumbos of Tufts University. What's yours?
Carleton University.
I know it's Carleton. What's the mascot?
I'm not sure what it is.
Oh. Canadian. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. Warm thanks to Harvey for the invitation and to everyone for coming. So my initial inclination upon receiving my panel assignment was to think about the ways in which the answer lies in the relationship between the Prince and Discourses on Livy. Reading Harvey's instructions more carefully, though, I noted that we were encouraged to respect the anniversary that we are commemorating today and focus on the Prince. But that work encourages its readers to depart from the orders of others when necessity compels them. So the thought crossed my mind that in so encouraging us, Harvey was in fact inviting us to show our impetuosity and thus pay tribute to Machiavelli and his mischievous spirit indeed. Convenient though this rationale might be for my initial inclination, I decided that an impetuous reaction would be just the kind of thing that one would expect at a conference on Machiavelli. And so the virtuous thing to do, I decided, would be to stick to Harvey's instructions and focus on the Prince. And that's what I will try to do. One way to begin to answer the question is to devise some sort of definition of a philosopher and then try to see whether Machiavelli fits the bill. But where would one begin? Taking the straightforward route of the literal meaning of the word would lead to all sorts of peril, since we would quickly find ourselves amidst my ancestors, whose alleged pursuits of wisdom Machiavelli claimed to despise. At the other end of the chronological spectrum lie the academic and professional philosophers, who in the main appear the very antithesis of Machiavelli's virtuous and energetic exemplars, eager to grab the bull by the horns. I thus opted for a seemingly more secure starting point, Machiavelli's own references to philosophy and philosophers in The Prince. I was relieved to discover that there are none to the former and only one instance of the latter. And that a surprising one. It occurs in chapter 19, the notorious treatment of avoiding contempt and hatred. There, in the context of a discussion of the lives and deaths of Roman emperors intended to show that the causes of their ruin are not unlike that which Machiavelli has advanced, his words, he announces his intention to examine everyone from, quote, Marcus the philosopher to Maximinus. After listing a series of difficulties that Roman emperors in particular faced, he singles out three, the philosopher among them, who, and I quote, all living a modest life, lovers of justice, enemies of cruelty, humane and kind, all except for Marcus came to a bad end. Only Marcus lived and died most honorably because he succeeded to the empire by hereditary right and did not have to acknowledge it as from either the soldiers or the people. Then, since he was attended with many virtues that made him venerable, while he lived, he always kept the one order, and the other within its bounds, and was never either hated or despised. Now, I'm not sure whether this striking passage is an exception or the exception to Machiavelli's treatment of historical figures in The Prince, but that is a matter for another investigation. Be that as it may, here is someone who personifies all those qualities that Machiavelli normally dislikes: modesty, justice, humanity, and kindness, but who does so under the right circumstances and who managed to draw and maintain the right boundaries and to even put the many virtues that made him venerable to such good use that he was never despised or hated. Those who have traced the trajectory of virtue in the prince know well that it is very rare for anyone to receive such an accolade from Machiavelli without having it revoked almost immediately for some failure to do even better. The philosopher then did as well as anyone could have hoped to. In addition to the solitary reference to a philosopher, however, the prince also contains a single reference to the object of philosophy, sapienza, in chapter 16. Once again, the constraints of our mandate made me rejoice. If only things were that simple. In the prefatory material of his edition of the Prince, Harvey exhorts those who think his translation good to learn Italian. Thinking it very good, I complied. One of the few things I learned in doing so is that sapere, a word that Machiavelli unfortunately uses more than once, is sometimes a verb referring to knowing, and sometimes a noun which, aided by the Latin meaning, refers to knowledge of an extent approximating wisdom. That problem of the relationship between knowledge and wisdom, of course, is an old one and certainly not one that I can treat here. Nevertheless, it means that in addition to that single reference to sapienza in chapter 16, one must contend with some others, most of which occur in chapter 18. First things first. Devoted to liberality and parsimony, chapter 16 is part of a section intended to show, through examples which anyone can appreciate, that things are not always what they appear to be. Having surveyed a series of cases which demonstrate that short-term generosity quickly puts a prince in a position quite unlike the one that the philosopher emperor enjoyed, Machiavelli declares that, quote, "There is more wisdom in maintaining a name for meanness, which begets infamy without hatred," end quote. This choice between the lesser of two evils is rendered more interesting by Machiavelli's own profession of meanness in the epistle dedicatory to the prince. The well-known letter to Vettori of nearly 500 years ago indeed shows that things are not always as mean and abject as they appear. Machiavelli uses sapere in chapter 11 to recognize the wisdom of Pope Sixtus. One seeking clarification as to what that wisdom consisted in will find in the Florentine histories that Sixtus was the first pope to hide problems by legitimizing them through pontifical authority. Although this kind of wisdom was not sufficient to save Sixtus from his fortune, it is one that Machiavelli returns to in chapter 18, where using sapere and its derivatives several times, he praises those who know, quote, "how to get around men's brains with their astuteness," end quote. With its emphasis on superficiality, this is the kind of goal that academic philosophers would consider anathema and rush to disown. It is, however, one of the more important reasons why we feel compelled to gather here today to discuss Machiavelli's thought. In that chapter, 18, Machiavelli declares that, quote, "the vulgar are taken in by the appearance and the outcome of a thing, and in the world there is no one but the vulgar," end quote. If this is true, then an interest in figuring out and delineating appearance and reality is understandable, and the several references to sapere in the same chapter are thus fitting. On the one hand, the theme of appearance and reality sounds plenty philosophical, for it dominates the investigations of Plato and St. Augustine, to take but the most obvious exemplars. On the other hand, these are the very thinkers whom Machiavelli seems to have in mind in chapter 15, when he declares his intention to focus not on imaginary republics, but on the effectual truth. Speaking of appearances, this notorious passage appears straightforward. It pits things imagined against things seen, and do-gooders against those who wish to, quote, maintain themselves. This, we are told, is the reason why Machiavelli is a realist, and perhaps why he is not a philosopher in any traditional sense of the term. But tradition is what Machiavelli wishes to break from, and it is far from clear to me what the opening paragraph of chapter 15 is supposed to mean. Of the many difficulties that interfere with my ability to understand it, the least formidable is to be found in chapter 6, so I will confine myself to that for now. There, Machiavelli's Latin title promises some discussion of two of the characteristics of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, virtue and self-sufficiency. We know that Machiavelli likes both, and that the latter is somewhat easier to understand than the former. We also suspect that there is some overlap between them. We do not know, however, precisely what these are, perhaps because a precise understanding cannot be had, and we certainly do not know where and how to acquire them. But the prince bears the signs of a how-to manual, so we should not be entirely out of order in expecting some guidance. Well, that guidance is offered in chapter 6, where Machiavelli opens it by telling us not to be surprised if he brings up the greatest examples. The first reason he gives is that the subject matter of the chapter is principalities that are, quote, altogether new, which means that the greatest examples will be examples of founders. That reason, however, is not as important as the one that follows it. Allow me to quote it in full. For since men always walk on paths beaten by others and proceed in their actions by imitation, unable either to stay on the paths of others altogether or to attain the virtue of those whom you imitate, a prudent man should always enter upon the paths beaten by great men and imitate those who have been most excellent, so that if his own virtue does not reach that far, it is at least in the odor of it. He should do as prudent archers do when the place they plan to hit appears too distant, and knowing how far the virtue of their bow carries, they set their aim much higher than the place intended, not to reach such height with their arrow, but to be able, with the aid of so high an aim, to achieve their plan. The most excellent examples fulfill Machiavelli's promise: Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus. But let us pause for a moment and reflect on what sort of advice someone is giving when he urges his reader to imitate Moses or Romulus. How different is this from the practice of those who have written on imagined republics? Perhaps not as much as chapter 15 would have us believe. After all, it is no accident that Machiavelli justifies it in chapter 6 by using an example that comes from another philosopher, the philosopher, if you ask St. Thomas Aquinas. Perhaps then the non-philosophical appearance of chapter 15 is part of Machiavelli's attempt to get around our brains with his astuteness. If Machiavelli's diagnosis of the limitations imposed on us by our minds is anywhere near the mark, someone who wishes to help us stay on our toes has his work cut out for him. Reinforcing the message that surfaces time and again throughout the book, chapter 15 of The Prince makes clear that anticipation and practice will not suffice, but must be supplemented by alertness. But how does one render alert beings that are inherently lazy, as Machiavelli thinks we are? His answer, as the examples of chapter 6 suggest, has something to do with foundings. As we know, however, the book on foundings is the Discourses, so I will have to depart from Harvey's orders briefly after all. Citing with apparent approval the practice of the Medici to shake up the government of Florence every few years, Machiavelli points out therein that the goal is to devise means that recreate the frame of mind of the founding when human beings are least at ease and thus somewhat more likely to meet the demands of the circumstances. Here, too, he is merely expanding on something that Aristotle had pointed out in the Politics. Machiavelli adds, however, that the means of doing so vary widely, as some of the best occasions for vigilance are also extremely dangerous. A problem that has its root in the mind requires a solution that speaks to the mind, and this, it seems, is what Machiavelli's preferred method of rendering the lazy vigilant is. Having told princes in no uncertain terms that they should have, quote, no other object, nor any other thought, nor take anything else as their art, but that of war and its orders and discipline, end quote, Machiavelli urges them to train and hunt incessantly, but closes the chapter by considering what this means for the mind. He recommends doing above all, as some excellent man has done in the past who found someone to imitate, who had been praised and glorified before him, whose exploits and actions he always kept beside himself. As they say, Alexander the Great imitated Achilles, Caesar Alexander, Scipio Cyrus. We are back, it seems, then, to the advice of chapter 6. I alluded earlier to the fact that the historical examples of the prince are almost always unsatisfactory. They could have done better. This explains why Machiavelli's, quote, greatest examples of chapter 6 are legendary, but also alerts us to the fact that we have valuable lessons to learn, not simply from the greatest successes, but also from the most dismal failures. In the only instance in which he brings up Marcus Aurelius in the Discourses, Machiavelli echoes the views he had expressed in The Prince. This time he does not offer any details about the philosopher-emperor's life, but rather places him at the end of a group of emperors whom he considers exemplars of how to order a kingdom. These were, quote, good, his word, not mine, and life under them was a golden age, once again, his words. One who considers, quote, the times of the other emperors will find them atrocious because of wars, discordant because of seditions, cruel in peace and war. So many princes killed with steel, so many civil wars, so many external ones. Italy afflicted and full of new misfortunes, its cities ruined and sacked. He will see Rome burning, the capital taken down by its own citizens, the ancient temples desolate, ceremonies corrupt, the cities full of adulterers. He will see the sea full of exiles, the shores full of blood. He will see innumerable cruelties follow in Rome, and nobility, riches, past honors, and above all, virtue imputed as capital sins. He will see calumniators rewarded, slaves corrupted against their master, freedmen against their patron, and those who lacked enemies oppressed by friends. And he will then know very well how many obligations Rome, Italy, and the world owe to Caesar. The lesson that Machiavelli draws from this contrast at the end of the chapter appears very plain. The first mode makes men, quote, secure, and after death renders them glorious. The other makes them live in continual anxieties, and after death leaves them as internal infamy, end quote. If this conclusion seems to contradict many others that Machiavelli draws in both the Discourses and the Prince, it is because he does what the best philosophers do, namely compel others to think. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And now we go to Waller, Randy Newell from Carleton. You really don't have a mascot up there?
I can't remember it, I'm sorry.
Raven.
You're right.
All right. That's very good. I'm not giving introductions because we have a program with extensive printed introductions.
So, our question is Machiavelli a philosopher? Of course, we'd have to know what a philosopher is to answer that question. If we mean first philosophy, technical philosophy, such as Aristotle or Kant, then no. Yet Francis Bacon, certainly a technical philosophy, acknowledged Machiavelli extensively as one of his sources. It's possible that the scientific method has a poetic basis, the conquest of fortuna, as its incentivization. We can also think about Bacon's echoing of the Columbus parallel from Machiavelli, the parallel between the scientist, his relationship to nature, and Columbus, who discovered the New World through an act of will and furnished the evidence afterward. Bacon's relationship of the scientist to nature internalizes what Machiavelli says in the Discourses about the relationship between law and healthy republics. That law replicates the severity of nature in order to restrain nature, cut it back, and tap its power. There are, of course, some overtly philosophical speculations in the Discourses about the eternity of the visible universe and a leaning instead toward Lucretius, but because our theme is the Prince, I'll confine my remarks mainly to that text. If Machiavelli is not a philosopher strictly speaking, there are many themes of philosophic import in the Prince, often disarmingly rendered as mere pragmatic advice. The Prince adapts Xenophon's Hero, with the difference that Machiavelli collapses the role of the poet into the role of the philosopher, a distinction that Xenophon maintains. One could also say that Xenophon's choice of the unmetaphysical Socratic as an ancient partial ally is itself a philosophical judgment about the character of Politicae. One might venture to say that Socratic dialectic, the dialectic of characters, is replaced in Machiavelli by a dialectic of events, recurring characters and actors grouped around the main contrast between the Romans and the present Christian or quasi-Christian rulers. In their way, some of Machiavelli's portraits, for example, Caesarea, brief as they are, compete with some of those in Plato, such as Alcibiades. Might we then say that history becomes the medium of statecraft if statecraft is no longer to be understood under the aspect of eternity? If we only have the shadows on the wall of the cave and no transcendental good, then we need a phenomenology of those shadows. That might be one way of understanding the turn to history. Now let me give a kind of shopping list of a few examples of issues of philosophic import in Machiavelli's Prince. First of all, as we've already heard from the previous speaker, the question of outstanding virtue, understood now as the mastery of fortuna. This entails a reversal of the classics, whereby the contrast between virtue and vice is replaced by the contrast between virtue and fortuna, with virtue now defined as the mastery of fortuna and vice as the reliance on it. There is also an incipient conflation of reason and revelation, as exemplified by the equation of Cyrus and Moses, the armed prophets, but perhaps that is best left for the panel on religion. Finally, there is Machiavelli's assertion that fortuna gives the prince or potential prince nothing other than the bare occasion. In other words, nature gives the statesman or potential statesman nothing. One reason that Xenophon's Cyrus must be replaced with Machiavelli's Cyrus is, of course, that Xenophon's Cyrus receives many gifts from Fortuna. And more generally, in Plato, the philosopher king is the chance coinciding of wisdom and royalty. The conquest of nature, to which Machiavelli summons us, the implied assimilation of reason to the will, in my view, means that Machiavelli is not simply a Latin Averroist. There is something futuristic, proto-Kantian, even proto-Fichtean in some reaches of the prince, although, of course, he expresses many reservations about how far this project can go. Man cannot literally remake the world up from the bottom, probably cannot even make political existence up from the bottom, owing to the cycles of time, the rise and fall of regimes, and the uncertainties of human nature. In the issue of creation out of nothing, Machiavelli is in some respects closer to Origen than he is to St. Augustine and Thomas. Another rubric of philosophical import is the question of the counselors that the prince has, and Machiavelli's formulation that the prince, rather than rely on a philosophical mentor, must now be the source of his own prudence. But that, of course, means a redefinition of the meaning of prudence. Machiavelli, we might say, is a writer who liberates princes and potential princes from the authority of the writers. Is he perhaps a prince himself, a prince of thought? His language in the discourses about how Xenophon constantly makes Cyrus do this and makes Cyrus do that makes one wonder if this is one example of how a thinker can, quote, introduce form into matter, from chapter 6 of The Prince. Another important theme, I think, is Machiavelli's maxim that all see you, few touch what you are. The last speaker touched upon this as well. It is, in fact, a kind of privileging of touch and interiority over looks and sight, and therefore is, in a certain sense, a reversal of the Platonic metaphysics of eros and the idea of the beautiful. I would argue, in broad strokes, that it culminates in the elevation of fear over love in that chapter of The Prince, nothing short of the reversal of Diotima's ladder in the Symposium, perhaps prepared by St. Augustine's division between the city of God and the city of man, which amounts to the sundering of Diotima's ladder. In other words, one issue would be to consider whether the diminution of nature, and especially the eros for nobility, in a certain sense, prepares a way for Machiavelli's own view of politics, perhaps as a kind of desacralized city of man. Again, though, this verges on the topic of Machiavelli's religion. Finally, there's the issue of the effectual truth. Like Bacon, I would characterize this as in Bacon, a pose of mere observation that masks a profound alteration in the meaning of reality. The division between what is and what ought to be is already an assertion of what really is. In other words, there is no Platonic eros for the noble as the path to philosophy. Yet Platonic eros, after all, is also observable in the real world, perhaps not measurable, but certainly observable. Bacon's idols of the mind are already anticipated by Machiavelli's imagined republics. Far from it being the case that men naturally desire to acquire, the tremendous psychological hold of the classical Christian conglomerate might as readily suggest that men spontaneously, naturally are open to a love of the immortally true, what Machiavelli calls the imagined republics. They therefore must master themselves inwardly in order for reality to be properly grasped. What looks like an appeal to spontaneous behavior, as opposed to the elaborate pedagogy of ancient virtue, turns out to be the summons to a project of immense self-mastery, the replacement of paideia with method. Or as Machiavelli puts it in chapter 15, the prince must learn to be able not to be good and to use and not use it according to necessity. If time permitted, we could say a bit about the various stages of this process of internal self-mastery. I believe that the summons to the project for the conquest of Fortuna must begin with the prince's mastery of his own inner nature, and especially that part of his own soul that might otherwise be naturally drawn toward the imagined republics. But let me conclude by saying that one way of summing up the import of Machiavelli's teaching might be as follows: that it attempts to provide a new universal teaching that combats both classicism and the Thomistic theology of glory, to use Luther's derogatory term for Thomism. Classicism and the Thomistic theology of glory, which share a reliance on the looks of the world, a teaching that Machiavelli attempts to replace with an appeal to self-interest and a deepening of the interior self, not accidentally favored by the emerging Reformation, if for opposite reasons. In Luther's case, to purge faith of a concern with worldly power; in Machiavelli's, to purge worldly power of a concern with faith. The celestial invisibility of the idea of the good and the kingdom of God is replaced by the dynamic invisibility of the inner self. They meet in what R.H. Tawney called the worldly asceticism that is the psychological root of liberal modernity. And that is definitely a philosophy, or at any rate, a political philosophy. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Randy. I'm from the Harvard Crimson, and I'll speak next because Christopher Lynch has a flight that's late. We'll take him when he comes. What's that? I said the Crimson. What are you, the Maroon? My contribution will focus on the phrase verita effectuale, featured in the first paragraph of chapter 15 of The Prince. Machiavelli concentrates the power of this phrase by using it just this once in all his writings. Indeed, Machiavelli scholars have been unable to find any other use of the term in the Italian Renaissance among humanist authors, and I'm not aware of any earlier use of it. With this new phrase, he says he departs from the orders of others. In it are contained new truth in philosophy and new effectiveness in politics, together elevating politics and bringing philosophy down to earth. I shall set forth the idea that Machiavelli was not caused by his context, but was the cause of a context, our context. He is the founder of modern political science, who also laid the foundation of modern philosophy and modern science by discovering what we today call fact, and who created what is today broadly called the modern world. Elevated politics and lowered philosophy come together in The Prince, understood not merely as a ruler, but also as a thinker or prophet, devoted to improving the prospects of princes, and incidentally, or not incidentally, their peoples, so that princes under Machiavelli's instruction become knowers of the world. He himself, he says in the Discourses, conveys as much as he knows and has learned through long practice and continual reading in worldly things, cose del mondo. What are these? Machiavelli seems to confine himself to politics, but he expands politics to include the world implying that the world governs politics, or politics governs the world, or both. In his day, any notion of the world immediately raised the question of which world, this world or the next. Here, religion and philosophy dispute the question of which world governs the other, and whether politics can manage or God must provide for human fortunes. Fortuna being, as everyone knows, a prominent theme of Machiavelli's. So for Machiavelli, the world is this world. With veritae effectuali, he explains why it is necessary to do evil. The world consists of the necessities of not, quote, coming to ruin in this world, as opposed to the demands or the attractions of salvation in the next world. There is such a thing as the whole world, but it is comprised of worldly things that have a limit to their life and are variable. Deceit is an aspect of the world. In the, quote, actions of the world, men ordinarily understand little, especially not what is extraordinary. Yet in Machiavelli's effectual truth, the truth is not forever hidden, but shown in its effects. Effectual truth means not only that the truth will have an effect, a consequence, but also that its effect will show. Princes must act so as to appear in certain ways, particularly in regard to religion. The deceit of the princes is expressed in what Machiavelli, borrowing from the Averroists, who were a force in his day, calls the sect. All sects or religions obey the necessities of human nature that require the people to be reassured they do not live under the necessity of being commanded, and that justice is possible. But justice is not possible. Thus, necessities are not necessarily recognized. In fact, they necessarily will not be recognized by peoples as opposed to princes. Knowledge of the world's necessities includes the necessary ignorance of most human beings regarding those necessities. The world is the world of sense, the visible or empirical world. Good effects are what they appear to be. They are deeds, faits accomplis. The accomplished fact of Machiavelli is the origin of the modern notion of fact. Fact is what everyone sees, including the vulgar. Indeed, principally the vulgar, because the vulgar many reveal the effectual truth of the few wise. Wisdom is in its effect on the unwise. It is not that the wise disappear or are no longer needed, but that their wisdom is effectual, and in that it is as it appears to the many of their audience. Fact is what can gain common assent, typically by being opposed to our intent or wish. Facts are stubborn or brute, standing in one's way and demanding acceptance. Sensational fact, such as the fact of Ramiro de Orco's death in 7th chapter of The Prince, are especially impressive. Behind the prosaic matter of fact of Locke and Hume lies Machiavelli's sudden and fearful fact. Machiavelli's appeal to the worldly prudence of the prince amounts to an appeal to the peoples, whom the prince must impress. Quote, in the world there is nothing but the vulgar. They set the standard of success. In this sense, Machiavelli is fundamentally democratic. The people believe in morality, and to believe that morality is possible, they believe that some person will make it possible. They personify the abstract notion of good in order to believe in God. Thus, Machiavelli shows that Christianity is the effectual truth of Platonism. His own personifications, such as Italy or the French, are spread all over his texts and must be examined for what they personify to be understood. Opposed to the effectual or factual truth of a thing is the, quote, profession of good in all regards that is fed by our imagination. For Machiavelli, the foundation for morality, what makes it reliable, what justifies taking the risk of coming to ruin by doing a moral deed, is a profession, a pretense of philosophy or religion. A profession of good, quote, in all regards, would have to be the good society as a whole, not merely isolated good actions taken by themselves. So Machiavelli says that many rely on, quote, imagined republics and principalities that have never been known to exist in truth. He does not give examples, but it is easy to supply them. An imagined republic might be Plato's Republic of Philosopher Kings, based on the idea of the good. And an imagined principality might be St. Augustine's City of God, promising salvation in the next world. These imagined professions question the authority of fact in the name of reason or revelation, on the basis of what is invisible, as if truth were to be found in an intelligible or a mysterious world that makes sense of and is superior to the visible world. For Machiavelli, the world has its necessities in polemical contrast to those alternatives. He knows he has to defend the world, truly his world, against them. The world he defends is grounded in the earth, terra, so as to give it resistance to and leverage against the attractions of heaven, as set forth diversely by Socrates with his successors and by Christianity. To preserve either a republic or a principality, one must take it back to or toward its beginning, as was said. And this means that an appeal to patriotism will not suffice. One must revive the original fear that precedes and is the basis for any later patriotism. Machiavelli was a patriot, to be sure, though for Florence or for Italy. And of course he says in a letter that he loves his patria much more than his own soul. As a philosopher, he might have said that his enterprise is grander than the defense of his patria, unless his patria is something even grander than Florence and Italy. His patria is the world of which he is a knower, sometimes presented as the earth, sometimes as Italy. The universal beginning is a first principle, but with a home, and the home is defined against what is foreign to the earth and above it. Machiavelli's effectual truth is an attack by fact on imagination. The classical philosophers knew very well that all actual cities are full of discord and injustice, and there was no disagreement with Machiavelli on this point. But they went on to imagine a city of harmonious justice, of harmonious justice without dissension, in order to see what justice fully required. For them, imagination is an aid to reason. With imagination, one can rise above justice as observed, to justice as it might be at its best and most complete, from fact to definition or form. Imagination fixes on the visible shape or form of things in order to make an image from which one can make an invisible form or definition. This is how they could think, contrary to Machiavelli and his modern successors, that the invisible is more real than the visible. Imagination does not disappear in Machiavelli, far from it, but it is demoted from its status as an aid to reason toward knowledge to a deviation of reason away from what is done. Clearly, Machiavelli, like Plato, has a perfect republic in his imagination, one that may even last forever. It is not the one imagined to be what perfect justice would require, as in Plato's Republic, but one imagined from reasoning with the necessities that face actual republics and finding remedies for their imperfect prudence. This perpetual republic, if it could exist, would also be like Plato's under a philosopher king or prince. The difference is that Plato has in mind not Socrates personally, but someone like him, whereas Machiavelli thinks of himself. Basing his republics his Republic on the facts of actual republics, he introduces the modern notion that practice follows directly from theory, so that knowledge, or firm science, ferma scienza, as he calls it, is perfected with practice. Knowledge is power. What Machiavelli knows is effectual. It makes him the prince, not just in principle, but in fact. One other phrase from our paragraph in The Prince needs to be examined. Machiavelli says that it appears to him more fitting to go directly, andare diretto, to the effectual truth, bypassing the profession of good. To look at the effect or the outcome of an event means to consider it in the light of the necessity, that is, the various necessities of its participants, and thereby to ignore their opposing beliefs and intentions regarding its goodness. Goodness is complicated and disputable. Necessity simplifies by going directly to the effect without regard to opposing claims and doubtful or contradictory reasonings. A difficulty remains, however, in the notion of effectual truth. Is all truth effectual truth? Is philosophy now to have an agenda for changing the world, rendering it rational, and leaving behind the former philosophy that wished merely to understand, and not to understand for the sake of power to effect change? Machiavelli promises that the effectual truth will work. It will save us from ruin among so many who are not good. But is it true that it works? Have we not seen in the 20th century that atheist regimes can be as harmful to humanity, indeed far more harmful than the religious ones that Machiavelli and Hobbes and all the other modern philosophers feared and despised and attempted to replace? The truth of effectual truth has to be judged by its promises, its professions of good. This truth would be plain truth, not effectual or tendentious truth. It is very difficult of access because of the very success of Machiavelli's enterprise, which covers over its beginning. The modern philosophy Machiavelli founded, like the modern science founded by his successors, has the character of progress, each stage going further than the preceding, and if not erasing it, rendering it obsolete. Machiavelli's ancient and biblical adversaries, and even Machiavelli himself, seem simplistic and irrelevant to us today. We are altogether too much impressed by effectual truth, which is simplistic in its essence and creates its own impermanence and irrelevance. I'm done. So Christopher Lynch has arrived from the Carthage. Now, do you have a mascot at Carthage?
Yes, we have a mascot.
And what would that be?
Do I have to tell you?
Yes.
Our mascot is Torchy. He is a flame.
All right. We'll go with the Carthage Flames. Yeah. Or the Carthage Ashes after the Romans got rid.
Am I up?
You're
okay.
up.
All right. As part of his campaign to overcome the tradition of classical political philosophy and Christianity, Machiavelli attacked not only that tradition's orientation by the best regime and the binding character of justice and morality, but also the superiority of the contemplative life over the practical life, the very possibility of the solitary life, the power of words over that of deeds, and the life of letters over that of war and action. It therefore seems that theoretical activity for its own sake is a casualty of his war on the tradition. On the other hand, Machiavelli also said that the golden times were those in which each could hold and defend any opinion, and that he would never judge it to be a defect to defend any opinion with reasons and without recourse to either authority or force, thereby suggesting that reason is his highest standard. This apparent contradiction raises the possibility that Machiavelli's attack on the tradition's prioritization of theory over practice was in fact for the sake of the theoretical life. I'm taking theoretical activity to be what Machiavelli calls reasoning about everything, and I take his representation or image of the greatest knowers to be military commanders. Their knowledge of the world is Machiavelli's version of the substance of philosophy, and rivalry or outright combat, as opposed to friendly dialectic, is the characteristic public activity of philosophers, while a particular kind of preparation for war is as close as Machiavelli comes to presenting the conduct of philosophy in private. His case for the necessity of military commanders constitutes Machiavelli's defense of philosophy. The chief benefit of this portrayal is that it is less vulnerable to appropriation by religion than classical philosophy proved to be. Its chief difficulty is that because it is justified strictly in terms of the results it produces for humanity at large, and without any reference to the inherent goodness of the activity within the soul of the philosopher, it remains vulnerable to vulgarization, much as classical philosophy was to deification. These respective practical benefits and costs have their corresponding theoretical benefits and costs, which I'll broach, if not delve deeply in my conclusion. No argument is necessary to show that Machiavelli attacked the tradition of political philosophy for taking its bearings by the best regime. Almost as evident is the intimately related attack on virtue as a mean between extremes or on the middle way. The ultimate reasons for these attacks are Machiavelli's conclusions: one, that this orientation by the best regime in the middle way leads in principle to the idea of a perfect being; two, that this orientation had become entwined in practice and in theory with an assertion of the revelation of the perfect being as such; and three, that the coincidence of 1 and 2 impose on anyone who might wish to revive virtue, including philosophic virtue, the necessity not merely of avoiding reference to or dependence on the best regime in the middle way, but the discovery or construction of new bases for defending and even understanding virtue, including, again, philosophic virtue, if it's to exist anywhere beyond the confines of the individual minds of very few intrepid but scattered, isolated, and beleaguered human beings. Let's consider some familiar passages. The drift of the or immoral rejection of how things ought to be and the embrace of how things are in Prince 15 is so deliciously familiar that it's easy to lose sight of the more fundamental emphasis on learning and knowledge, and indeed on their relative independence from morality, though not denial or revaluation of moral reality. Just two things are said there to be necessary: to learn to be able not to be good, and to be so prudent as to know exactly how and when to move between moral vice and moral virtue. More than the immoralism of the passage, one must see its radical intellectualism. In the very Aristotelian terms being rejected, intellectual virtue must free itself from any dependence on or even essential connection to moral virtue. The denial of moral virtue as a mean and the assertion of the necessity of moral vice entail not a denial of the reality and even efficacy of morality, but the assertion of the primacy of reason over morality. All of Machiavelli's immoralisms amount to the assertion of the primacy of reason as the knowledge of the necessary cause and effect relationships among human passions as they tend to give rise to praise and blame. It is sometimes better to choose one moral quality and at others its opposite. It is never better or even possible to choose the opposite of prudence. It alone among the virtues or praiseworthy qualities does not vary. To display that the others change but prudence remains the same amounts to a repetition of the declaration of independence of theoretical from moral virtue. Not incidentally, it issues in a return from the Aristotelian teaching to a modified version of the Socratic teaching on the relation of moral to intellectual virtue. Intellectual virtue is true virtue, and what is called by the tradition moral virtue is virtue only insofar as it serves true virtue. Moral virtues are at most means to the ends of the exercise of intellectual virtue and perhaps simply reducible to it. Machiavelli's difference with the teaching of the Socratic tradition is the absence of the assertion that prudence or wisdom consists in or assumes the right ordering of the soul. That is, for as important as it is to see Machiavelli's kinship with Socrates on this point, one must also recognize the criticism that is present in Machiavelli's modification of the orientation of the Socratic tradition that he gave birth to. By speaking publicly as though the world were ordered, especially doing so in such a way as to indicate that we human beings are provided for by that order, even Xenophon's Socrates opened up the possibility that became an actuality in Machiavelli's time, that criminal men would use this public speech to rule without virtue, rather than, as intended, to be checked in their rule, either in their own thoughts or by the deeds of others sustained by these words. The very teachings that were meant to moderate tyranny's inevitable hostility to excellence became a uniquely potent weapon of religious political tyranny, a tyranny even and especially over thought. There is no evidence that I'm aware of to indicate that Machiavelli was moved to indignation by this state of affairs. Classical political philosophy had simply failed by its own standards. The situation is further clarified by the passage in Discourses 2:2 on the contemplative and active lives, where Machiavelli seems to demote the contemplative life and exalt the active life. It is the context of that passage that gives this appearance most strongly, since Machiavelli clearly is in favor of the love of freedom, and he partly attributes the decline of the love of freedom to the Christian religion, which glorifies humble and contemplative men more than active men. Worse, there are both the exalted, humble contemplatives and the criminal prelates, the latter of whom exploit the many by directing attention away from themselves and towards the exalted. Similarly, there are the exalted, humble themselves, who point away from the criminals and toward God. One naturally infers that it is incorrect to assert the superiority of the contemplative life over the active life, since it is partly the cause of the problem Machiavelli wishes to resolve or ameliorate. Notice, on the other hand, the qualifiers. Notice, on the other hand, these four things. First, the qualifiers Machiavelli places on the contemplative life as it has become part of the Christian tradition, that is, humble, abject, contemptuous of the human. Two, notice his distinction between interpreting Christianity according to idleness and doing so according to virtue. Three, notice his insistence on referring to Christianity as our religion rather than by name. And four, notice the practical result of the analysis, namely to prepare oneself to defend one's fatherland. I suggest that all four of these points, but especially the last, negatively indicate an alternative character to theoretical activity that Machiavelli is seeking to lay out. A proud and assertive theorizing that honors the human by attending to its strivings rather than its idleness, and to do so in such a way as to make almost another religion or comprehensive way of life, which would be in service to the fatherland rather than undermining it. Thus, the problem Machiavelli faces is sketched in this passage: how to conceive, describe, and justify a way of life that is, at its core, thinking, but which is not vulnerable to assimilation to the humble and to the deprecation of the human. An absolutely necessary condition of a solution to this problem would be that theoretical virtue, to recur to Aristotelian terminology, would need to break free from moral virtue publicly and openly, rather than privately and hypocritically. What would a life that embodies such a solution look like? The most complex answer to this question is contained in Machiavelli's depiction in the Discourses on how military commanders are made. Were we to delve into that, we would see, I think, Machiavelli admitting, by means of the example of Camillus, the theoretical problem with his solution. That the activity of knowing in Camillus's knowledge of the world can account for and manage the motions of the world, but it can't easily account for its own stability. If, alternatively, we were to look at the fullest depiction of such a life, we would turn to that contained in the Life of Castruccio, the book by Machiavelli, which contains the most massive presence of an ancient philosophy book in it, even if it's Diogenes Laertius. And we'd find there, I think, war as a way of life functioning as a clear stand-in for philosophy as a way of life, as opposed not just to religion, but as opposed to a life lived according to doctrines of any kind. So, in general, on the political plane, it would appear as a twofold patriotism, this solution, attending to the most pressing needs of its country, but also fending off claims that, from the perspective of eternity, countries are paltry things not worth defending. Essential to the latter defense is saying and demonstrating that excellence is not a mean pointing to a perfect man who points in turn to a perfect being. Is one to conclude from all this that morality is merely conventional for the Machiavellian philosopher, and that there is no realm of existence for Machiavelli other than the political? By leaping with both feet into Machiavelli's account of another realm of existence, we can see not just that the answer is no on both counts, but also that he has his theoretical problem in mind and that he's working it out. This is the realm of love, discussed most revealingly in another letter taken from the extended exchange that partially occasions this conference. A little over a year after his announcement of the completion of The Prince, Machiavelli writes to Vittori a letter in which he describes how someone reading some of their letters would think that only great and weighty thoughts could ever come from their heads. But then upon, quote, upon turning the page, it would seem to the reader that we, still the very same selves, are petty, fickle, lascivious, and we're directed towards chimerical matters. The very sameness of each of their selves is insisted on even as their alternation is defended against the charge of bringing contempt upon them. Indeed, the alternation is lauded because, quote, we are imitating nature which is changeable. Whoever imitates nature cannot be censured. I think to have a shot even at understanding this letter, one has to see that Machiavelli is coyly scolding Vittori for several not insignificant things. 1, getting speech about love, wrong. 2, getting love itself, wrong. And 3, getting the nature of the world as a whole, wrong. In the letter to which Machiavelli is responding, Vittori speaks in a most vulgar manner about love, and he does so, and this, I think, is what elicits Machiavelli's strongest disapproval. He does so in direct connection with philosophic speech, or the issue of philosophic speech. Having read a letter in which Machiavelli himself reported an intense love, Vittori thinks to himself that, quote, this world is nothing other than love, or to speak clearly, lust. Going on to explain that he alleviates his boredom by thinking of pleasant things, he says, but I know of nothing that gives more delight to think about and to do than, and then he here ends his sentence with a coarse word in Italian as well as English, which ends with the word F. The next sentence begins alliteratively with philosophy. Philosophize as you want, he says, but this is the utter truth, which many people understand this way, but few will say. In reply, Machiavelli opens his letter with a charming sonnet about the power of Cupid to overcome even the most resistant. Then he explicitly notes that it is meant, this sonnet, it's meant as a barb, an arrow like Cupid's. Next, he points out the alternation between light and grave things that takes place even within the realm of love. And finally, with Ovid's help, he compares his love to the never consummated love for Daphne that causes Machiavelli's Apollo, anyway, to hunt but never catch his prey. And then follows the lines about the alternation between light love and grave politics. The second half of the same letter is devoted to a grave political venture, concerning which Machiavelli reports having recommended to Vittori's brother that the brother gain reputation for himself by unifying a province through playing, in effect, he even uses these names, through playing Ramiro d'Orco to Giuliano de' Medici's Cesare Borgia. If you think about the passages, you recognize that it perhaps not so nice joke is being suggested, because this would mean gaining political unity by getting his self-same body chopped in two. the grave side of life has more than its share of light sides also. To take another leap in conclusion, I take this all to mean that for Machiavelli, the nature of things, while changeable, is made of two heterogeneous realms, at least one of which, that of love, is itself made up of heterogeneous realms, which are the objects of the Machiavellian philosopher's theoretical activity. So what kind of philosopher is he? I suggest the possibility that he is a pre-Platonic, Socratic philosopher in new circumstances, who opposes the Socratic tradition for the sake of the Socratic life, which in his time can only mean having arms of one's own.
Thank you. We're ready and eager for discussion. If you want to make a point or ask a question, please do it plainly, not to say loudly, because we want to get it on our video. Yeah.
Some of the speakers have raised the question of Latin Averroism with respect to Machiavelli, whether Machiavelli is or is not a Latin Averroist. And stressed instead some aspects of his thought which are prepared, you suggested, by Augustine. There's a kind of that Machiavelli is necessarily preceded by Christianity. Heroism, to the extent that it points back to Lucretius, not require this kind of Christian break with. Perhaps you specifically said that you thought he was not a Latin Averroist, where this seems to come in some of the other talks as we've seen.
Okay, I chiefly had in mind to the extent that we mean by Averroism a sense that a return to some form of classical philosophy is entirely adequate for guidance in political life, and that the concerns of religion can be somehow sidelined. To that extent, I question the degree to which Machiavelli shows this Averroist influence, because it seems to me that the summons to impose human control over Fortuna and to refashion the conditions of our circumstances implies a kind of break with any version of classical thought. So that's chiefly what I had in mind.
Yes, Nathan.
Presentations were rich and deep, and I'm not going to venture onto their level, but just mention two figures in the prince. One of them, Marco Philosopher, Ioannis indicated when explicit mention or use of the word philosopher. Seems to me that Machiavelli is very critical of him in being, since the whole terrible situation in which the late Roman emperors are village and is caused by Commodus corrupting or making licentious the military, and who makes this is contrary to Gladiator, which tells us the truth about that. According to other historical accounts, it is Marco Philosopher who is responsible for letting continuing hereditary rule. He comes to power through hereditary rule, and he lets it go to this subsequent emperors, which at least to me reminds me of the failure of the philosopher kings in the Republic to ensure. Despite or even not despite, but all the more so for the praise of Marcus, there is therefore a criticism that this thing cannot be continued. The other figure I'd like to mention, who I think has not been mentioned, is Philopoemen in chapter 14, who is said to converse with his friends and listen to their opinions and then defend his opinions with reasons, which is quite similar to the passage that I think several people have mentioned, certainly Chris Lynch, where Machiavelli himself says in Book 1, Chapter 58 of the Discourses that he considers it never a defect to defend any opinion with reasons without authority. So there is a quasi-philosophic, and somebody he's invented, or in this respect, the story is perhaps somewhat different from Plutarch's account, I think. A quasi-philosophical figure, but one who discusses such things only with reference to war against the enemy. So it's also, as Mr. Lynch and I think Mr. Mansfield too suggested, that this philosophy is a polemical philosophy that's essentially at war with its enemy in a way that classical political philosophy was not.
Can I say something
Go
about
ahead.
Marcus?
Yeah.
I think that's right, and there's a further clue to that, which is that the passage in the Discourses, where he refers to him once more, lists this kind of responsibility in the line of succession as one of the defects of certain emperors. So one of the things that he says about those who caused the series of bills that I read earlier, or several of them, do so by sort of preparing the troops in a way that would make the life of their successors difficult. And I believe there's a reference to that in 19 as well, in the Prince. And so he clearly has those kinds of effects in mind. But that makes me think that this is yet another invitation to stop yourself and think that there's something wrong with the example. In other words, it so deviates from the way in which he presents other historical figures in the Prince that my first reaction is to say there's something strange about this account. It's too positive. And why is it so positive, since the only benefit that seems to flow from it is the fact that Marcus gets to die a natural death? The further research reveals that part of the supplementary account of the Discourses reveals that part of the benefit lies in the fact that it makes for commodious living for the subject, but it also lets this kind of detail creep in, that it's not just what they do during their own rule, but how they set the stage for what is to follow. And since this is a consideration of an empire and not just of individual emperors, the criticism is there.
To which, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that, among other things, I think the reference to Marcus the Philosopher is a kind of pleasantry on Machiavelli's part, because if you think of, say, Plato's Republic, the chief impediment to justice is the love of one's own. The philosopher of all people, in principle, is supposed to be capable of sacrificing the love of his own, above all children, to what is just. So I think in part Machiavelli is saying that Marcus, supposedly a philosopher, succumbed precisely to this love of one's own and allowing the unworthy Commodus to succeed him. So if it's not possible for a person who seems to have been a bona fide philosopher to sacrifice the love of his own for what was just, how much less likely is it that most people will? I think that's one of its possible implications.
At the end of chapter 19 of The Prince, and Machiavelli sums up, and he there rather forcibly pairs Marcus the philosopher with Severus the emperor, who in the Discourses is called a criminal. So I think that's a comment too on the philosopher must learn to associate himself with criminality, which is I I think not what you find in Plato's Republic.
Could I just make a brief comment on Philip Homan? Is the differences from the sources, and this is one of these instances when Machiavelli really does draw attention to the writers who praise him. So one's entitled to go and look. I think that the main difference from the Livy case of praising is that there are moments when Philip Homan is depicted as being alone and meditating on his own, and sometimes being with others, and then he engages in the question and answer when he's with others. Machiavelli cuts out the alone. Machiavelli thinks only of this, and he thinks about it in times of peace and in times of war, but not only about these matters. Then in Plutarch, it's a very interesting difference where philosophy really is studied by Philip Homan. But it's also the case that he faces a big life, a big existential choice. Is he going to be a great athlete and go with order and regularity, or is he going to be a soldier? And he realizes these are totally opposed ways of life, as opposed as, say, the one that Castruccio faces in the life of Castruccio, between the religious life and the military life. And he says, no athletics for me. I'm going to be a soldier so that I can fight all the time.
Tom Faulkner from the Boston College Eagles.
A light question and a heavy question. How does your account of love, Chris, fit with the comedies, which both seem to reduce love to lust? Calculated, managed lust, but that. And the heavier question is I guess to Harvey. Suppose someone said, Harvey, that the effects to which you point in the 20th century are not the fruit of Machiavelli's thinking, but of thinkers who, in fact, went in a different direction from Machiavelli, of various kinds, whether it be Marx or Nietzsche or Hegel or whomever you pick. Wouldn't you have to show that in fact Machiavelli somehow led or evoked or somehow provoked these? And since I know you probably are thinking this, you mentioned, after all, conquest of nature or mastery of nature. This is really a kind of inducement to have you develop the argument a little farther. I mean, all our emphasis on facts also went with an impossibility, it seems, to talk about values.
So,
Light first. I didn't mean to say that he denies that love is lust. He's willing to do that, and I know you know, and I'm sure most people here know, that he is more than willing to indulge in the most vulgar of sexual stories. So it's not as though he's some sort of response to Vittorian shock. It's that he's insisting upon two things. One, there really are two whole realms of existence, to Vittori, and sort of scolding him for that, saying, you said everything's love. No, it's half, there's a split. It seems that, my main point is, it seems that those two differences go all the way down to the roots of things. It's not like everything's so much in flux that those two are going to go away. But then since he talks about love as also having grave and light sides within it, I infer that those differences are somehow really rooted in reality. I don't think that they're rooted in eidetic structures, but he seems to acknowledge them. And it's also, I think, the case that it works well with the comedies in that, there are satisfied lovers and there are frustrated lovers, and one can see existence going either way. And these are alternatives that one faces, even if it's all cut off from the natural end of sex, which is procreation. I mean, so I'm not claiming he's a Thomistic, philosopher?
I say that Machiavelli he insisted on the necessity of fraud in the makeup of the prince, such that the virtue, the new virtue, sort of aggressive virtue that he proposed, is combined with old-fashioned morality or belief in justice, honesty, and decency, which he thought could never be abolished. That a new morality would always have to play fraudulently against that old morality, and it could do, and it would make its way with shocking or sensational presentations of fact, which depend on the existence of that old morality. So what happened after Machiavelli is that public reason, to use John Rawls's phrase, came into existence, and fraud was abandoned in favor of a new morality of self-interest, which made justice possible on a new basis. But a justice which is based on self-interest is always open to reproach and indeed rebellion on the basis of genuine morality, of justice and goodness. And that revolt was made in Rousseau. So instead of combining sort of aggressivity and old-fashioned morality as Machiavelli did, the modern successors of Machiavelli split those into two different things: a routinization of effectual truth into fact and modern epistemology, and ending in Hume and Adam Smith and economics on the one hand, and on the other hand, Rousseau's pioneering rebellion against that, leading to Kant and to Marx and to Nietzsche, and a kind of wild and uncontrollable idealism. So somehow Machiavelli, I think, tried to keep his quote idealism and his quote realism together in a difficult but still possible combination, and it may be that his successors, as you suggested, betrayed him. Yes.
Most of Mr. Mansfield's talk, but he was emphasizing especially the effectual truth, this phrase, and the way that it's something very new and what it means. And as far as I understood, he was giving an interpretation that's in disagreement with yours. And so I just wondered if that's the case, and if so, if you two could sort of discuss, bring out your differences a bit. As far as I understood, he was saying that this was not merely, that the effectual truth wasn't merely a new way of presenting things, but also a new way of understanding truth, maybe a more practical understanding of truth, and an elevation of politics vis-a-vis the contemplative life. Whereas Mr. Lynch mentioned that he presented it as ultimately a Socratic way of life. So do you, in fact, disagree on this? And if so, would you like to talk to each
maybe
other
we do.
about
Yeah. Yes, the effectual truth. Yes, I think that's something new, and it's meant to be a kind of truth which makes itself effective without any outside aid. So if you look in the Bible, there you see the truth is said to need the energy. This is in a letter of Paul's letter to the Ephesians, the energy of practice in order to bring it to the people. And if you look in Marsilius, who was well known to Machiavelli, I think, you see he refers to hindrances to the spreading of the truth. One of them being, the principal one being the papacy. So in both cases, the truth needs some kind of addition to it, which will make it effective in the world. In the first case, sort of divine aid. In the second case, human aid. Whereas I think Machiavelli has this idea that the truth can be understood in such a way as to make itself effective. I think that's what an effectual truth is, and that's what a fact is in the way that we use that term today. It's impressive, and it stops you. It can't be reasoned away. In Plato's, I was saying, what the imagination is an aid to reason that enables you to reason away what you observe. You look carefully at it, and you make an image of it, and you think about it, and you come to a definition which explains the thing better than the thing as it appears to us. So the justice in Plato's Republic makes justice clearer than if you try to observe it in the world. And so that's what I understand the Socratic or classical rationalism to be. Whereas Machiavelli sets up this modern rationalism, which begins with the recognition of fact and does use imagination and reasoning, but in order to make, as we say today, concepts, or concepts which don't come out of an understanding or a working out of things or beings as you see them in the world, but rather those things or beings are facts, and you can't reason them out any further.
And where does the category of possibility fit in the scheme that you're laying out? Which, I mean, Machiavelli imagines things to be which are not yet, and brings them about through deeds. What status does that imagined possibility have before it exists?
Well, it's based on the observation of actual events, and those actual events are taken not as promises on their own basis, but as facts that must be accepted and then worked from. So you must accept that most people are religious. Most people understand religion as morality as religion. You think you're good, and that means you expect other people to be good to you. To be good means to expect other people to be good to you. So you don't have to induce it. You expect gratitude. And Machiavelli says, well, you won't get that. So you have to be satisfied with that fact, that you're not going to get gratitude in this world. And so you have to then work out and imagine a republic or a principality or a way of governing that accepts this truth. And this working out of remedies would be the new effectual truth that enables you to change the world and not just understand it. So it seems to me that Machiavelli, yes, is a philosopher in the ancient sense. And we haven't mentioned yet the letter of December 10th, 1513. This is where the one in which he says he's composed this little work called The Prince. But then he goes on to describe a day in his life. It's wonderful, just a wonderful description, how he spends the afternoon with the vulgar, or even calls them vermin, but he has a good time playing games of chance. So, but then he sits down and puts on his cloak of royalty, and he says, sits down to the food that is mine alone. Now, he doesn't use the word philosophy there, but you couldn't ask for a better picture of the life of the philosopher as opposed to the non-philosopher. And it does seem that here, same as with Plato, those two are divided in such a way as they seem to have different natures. He's just a different person altogether from those that, I mean, it's true, it's important that he likes to play with these people and talk to them and fight with them and have play their games. That's his, you could say that's his political philosophy. And that's why he spends most of his time in his works on political things, military things, and not on, as you say, technical philosophy, like David Hume, say. But that's a new, changed philosophy, which it's really hard to square with the decisiveness with which he distinguishes the non-philosopher from the philosopher. That they're really together in a prince. A prince has to know in a way that previous princes have not known. Philosophy, or at least some philosophy, to treat with the danger of religion as it presents itself in his time. And so, and on the other hand, the philosophers have to, as I said, or what he says really is bring it down to earth. In Book 3, Chapter 3 of the Discourses, I have as Brutus kissing the earth. That's I think what the philosopher has to do. So that seems to go against the presentation in the letter.
Yeah, and I would just say briefly that the fact that there's that tension there, the question is, what does one do with it? It seems on the one hand that he allows these natural differences, and it seems on the other hand his doctrines don't square with certain things that he allows. Then what does one make of those doctrines? And I think one has to start taking them with a grain of salt, not saying that one can't learn things about the nature of things from them, but they have to be taken with a grain of salt, as one probably needs to do with such theories as Platonic theories of the forms. So I guess that's where maybe we start to differ. And I say when that problem arises and he shows that he understands the nature of philosophy and also seems to know he needs to be able to give an account of it and points to the problem of giving an account to it, that he's pointing to the defect of certain doctrines of his.
Could I just say something about this issue of possibility? That I mean, one way of connecting this to the question of fortuna is to suggest that great things have happened in the past. There have been successful benchmarks of virtuous princes, but they've somehow happened spontaneously. They haven't happened for the reasons the classics say. So one way of looking at his enterprise would be to say, let's take what fortuna manifests spontaneously and consciously reenact it. That seems to me one common motif linking the prince to the discourses, that what has happened without design or by chance can now perhaps be successfully imitated and replicated.
Harvey, can I ask you something about the distinction that you drew?
Go ahead.
So I like this distinction between truth that speaks for itself and truth that needs the republic. But what do you make of the degree to which he needs to reinterpret various things, including things we might classify as facts? Think of the way he pitches the discourses as a radical reinterpretation.
But the radical reinterpretation is in terms of the effectual truth of the Livian stories that he's interpreting, and I'm trying to think of an example. So he's showing that he's got the facts, and that these that people who boast of being good and of the possibility of being good really have some intent that will make those professions favorable to himself. Good means good for you, and you have to be you have to anticipate that other people will use your professions against you, and so the effectual truth makes you wary and concerned, not only for what is immediate, but what may come in the future in the way of what used to be called fortune.
So does that mean that the facts don't speak for themselves, after all?
No, it means that those who have spoken for the facts have exaggerated or have tried to interpret them away and have told pretty stories that aren't true. Yes.
Just following up on this, one of the reasons, and it's an interesting question that we have to ask, is Machiavelli philosopher? That in itself is interesting. One of the reasons we might want to ask that question is because he doesn't always seem entirely self-conscious about his ends, where his ends are coming from. So when you say that the facts speak for themselves, or what he's really interested in is the effectual truth without anything above politics, couldn't you say that he still is in fact driven by some understanding of the good? He wants to improve the world some way. He's not really explaining the ground of that. So it's not so straightforward. There is still an idea of the good. It doesn't have anything to do with the facts, or maybe it has something to do with his observation of fortune or nature. But he's not entirely self-conscious, at least in his writings about that. So if he's not self-conscious about that, you say, play devil's advocate, that he isn't entirely philosophic, that he is driven by something that he's not fully aware of.
No. There's one thing I didn't mention, which I would have if I'd remembered it at the beginning, on greatness. So he promises to bring a good which is common to each of us. Bene comune di ciascuno, of each individual of us will be benefited by Machiavelli. So this seems to be a common good which benefits us each individually, that is common but for each individual's advantage. Good. So it's not a collective good, but it's one which is consistent with his principle of uno solo. That the prince has, in order to make himself truly a prince, has to make himself dependent on no one else outside him, and needs to protect himself his own arms, and not depend on the arms of others. So that sets each one of us against every other of us, and yet in such a way, and this is his promise, that all of us can benefit. A common benefit without a community. Common to each one of us, but separately individual. And that's what a fact is. Yes.
It occurs to me that classical political philosophy seems to me to be concerned with truth.
Sense that Socrates, for instance, went, sort of went out into the marketplace, sort of at risk to himself, and confronted various people, and it seemed necessary for him, for whatever reason, to confirm something in other people, and one of the results of this is that distinguishes him from Machiavelli, it seems, is that he's primarily concerned with sort of the people who would have the higher claims for wisdom, potential teachers. So he doesn't look at the vulgar. And so I was wondering if you could, Professor Mansfield, if you could talk a little bit about.
You want to take this? He's Gadfly. He wants to wake you up. So Machiavelli doesn't. He knows that he can't do that. That the effectual truth of philosophizing in this rather exaggerated way that Socrates explains in the Apology is you'll get yourself hurt or killed. That's part of the reason why, though we're all calling him a philosopher, I guess, he says so little about philosophy. It's not a life that he promotes as such. So only 3 times philosophy mentioned in the discourses and only once in the Prince. And so going out and examining people is that's what you're examining is their professions of good. And what Socrates does is to try to take what the first opinion that you might have and show how inadequate it is, how contradictory it is, and to improve it. That's the use, what I'm talking about, the use of imagination toward an invisible truth, as opposed to actually causing some benefit to them, which requires bamboozling them, most people. You have to wake up the princes, but bamboozle the peoples. And that's because la bontà non basta. It's not enough to be good. But people think that it is enough to be good. That's what it means to be moral. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yes.
Yeah. Final decision between the two, not because love live like intrinsic quality of like love or fear, but rather because fear emerges from the prince and from the self.
Yeah.
And it seems that in this chapter, when we pay attention to that last few lines, Machiavelli would have chosen love. It had been love that like dependent on the person. Mm-hmm. And therefore it seemed to me that Machiavelli's answer to the question that is, after which the chapter is titled, is really neither. What's important, really, what comes out of that chapter is the importance of self-reliance, a feature that we know is essential in both the Prince and the Republic.
Right.
And I feel that it puts some strain on your point about this reversal of Deotima's ladder, and I wonder if you could perhaps respond to that.
Sure. I think what's happening in this chapter, through the use of Scipio as a kind of compendium of the classical approach, you might say, is to suggest that the classical approach focused on the love of the beautiful as an inducement in princes and statesmen to make themselves lovable to their subjects and fellow citizens, and that this notion of eros as a pursuit of immortality, partially through civic virtue, could make princes worthy of this kind of admiration in their fellow citizens and subjects. And to make a long story short, I think for Machiavelli, this is a profoundly subversive understanding of statesmanship. It's why he thinks that Scipionic statesmanship is incipiently demagogic and unhealthy to a vigorous republic. But more fundamentally, it's based on a kind of delusion about human nature, which is that princes, let alone their subjects or fellow citizens, are actually capable of being guided by this intimation of the beautiful as an inducement to admire the virtue of virtuous rulers. So I'm suggesting that what Machiavelli is saying is it's more reliable in statecraft to rely on the invisible and interior passion of fear rather than the passion of eros, which orients us to the visible world and this classical hierarchy of erotic fulfillments. So yes, it's true that the prince can apply this in a fairly brutal way, if you like, through playing upon the fear of his subjects. But I think at a deeper level, it's about the need to extirpate that erotic longing in oneself, not only in one's subjects, but in oneself as the prince. And if I could just briefly tie this back to two of the other questions, it's not the case that the ancient thinkers are unrealistic or unworldly about the concomitants of political success. A part of Machiavelli's attempt to parody the classics is to suggest that they were somehow naive or pie-in-the-sky idealists. But of course, Plato and Aristotle and Xenophon are perfectly well aware of the darker side of politics, the need for the use of force and coercion. But at the end of the day, I think what Machiavelli would say is that classical philosophy has failed and that the solution to classical philosophy's failure is to get rid of classical philosophy. In other words, his new science of politics, I think, can arguably bring about precisely the good things that the classics thought they wanted to bring about for people. But I think Machiavelli is saying that he can do this more successfully than they on a new basis, which requires that they somehow be jettisoned. So that would be the beginnings of an answer.
Yes, Vicky.
That you haven't mentioned, which is 5:1. And to quote the jumbo up there, who, if I got it correct, said that what Machiavelli wants to do is to render the lazy vigilant or perhaps active. And this particular chapter of the Florentine Histories talks about that and talks about philosophy, I think, in the most pointed sort of way. And in that passage, he says that philosophy, I think, is a type of corruption. More precisely, it's a type of idleness, odzio, and he calls it onesto odzio. It's honorable leisure or idleness, but it's idleness nevertheless. And he praises Cato in that passage for expelling the philosophers from Rome when they came from Greece. When he saw how the Roman youth was beginning to follow them about with admiration, and since he realized the evil that could result to his fatherland from this honorable leisure, he saw to it that no philosopher could be accepted in Rome. And obviously, onesto odzio is some way, and the commentators have pointed this out, is some way akin to the ambitious idleness, is what he calls Christianity. It's still idleness, but it's different. So I'm wondering, to the extent to which maybe we could reconcile these views to say that Machiavelli is trying to protect Socratic philosophy, perhaps, or at least the theoretical life for him, but not for others. Because often when he talks about philosophy, he talks about schoolmasters, expelling them, and beating them. There's this wonderful passage in the Discourses where he talks about Camillus, and Camillus did a very humane thing. What did he do? He had the youths who were being taught by a schoolmaster, he had them been given rods, and he had them beat the schoolmaster, and you can't help but think about Socrates in that position. So, and in the same passage in 5:1, he says there's a cycle, right? Captains come before philosophers, and the leisure of letters is corrupting. So maybe when we come to an age that is corrupt, we can have a theoretical life. But I'm not convinced that Machiavelli wants to get rid of the theoretical life as long as he can be prince. And when he's not, maybe we have to go back to that.
Can John Bow speak?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think this is right, and I want to put in a word for the gadfly version, despite what Harvey said, with which I generally agree. I think he is more of a gadfly than he's given credit for. And part of the way in which he is a gadfly is by invoking these kinds of contrasts and apparent contradictions that cause you to go back and look. And when he urges the recreation of the psychology of the beginnings, the warning is that you could do this by starting a war, but you could also do it in different ways that don't involve the dangers of starting a war. And he does that in that other passage on Marcus in the Discourses, where he talks about the two different states that you could have if you were led by someone like Marcus or you were led by someone like Caesar. And those kinds of not quite philosophical, but nonetheless reminders, not of facts, but of a reinterpretation of the facts, are one way of doing this. And what he does throughout the Prince and the Discourses is to go and reread the facts in a way that will provide the basis for such a recreation of the psychology of beginnings. So I take that to be some kind of activity akin to the gadflies. As to the question of is he less democratic a gadfly than Socrates, I'm not so sure Socrates is interested in awakening everyone. Making a mockery of the teachers of Athens is not quite the same thing as expecting everyone to take the right lesson. And what happens to him is evidence of that.
I would say Machiavelli is a gadfly in regard to Christianity. That's what distinguishes him from the other philosophers. The other philosophers, the other schools of philosophy, you could say the humanists, or if there's schools of the humanists, the Evrigenis, even the scholastics, all are able somehow to make peace with Christianity. And it may be that they would be more critical of it if they had the opportunity or if they wished. But Machiavelli is the one who openly attacks Christianity, and in the three crushing criticisms in the Discourses, he doesn't attack religion, but he attacks the Christian religion as hostile to human virtue and to successful politics.
But not in order to wake it up, right? I mean, not for its good.
Yeah, to wake up people against it.
Yeah.
I have to dissent a wee bit here. It seems to me that even the presentation of Socrates in the Platonic dialogues, it's Socrates himself in the Phaedo and elsewhere who announces the importance of the ideas or forms. He's not simply a gadfly. There's a metaphysical content, in my opinion, in all Socratic dialectic, in Plato. So since I don't believe that, I don't believe that you can understand Socrates without a metaphysical component. And since I don't believe that Machiavelli thinks that metaphysical component is in any way, shape, or form compatible with his own signs of politics, I'm afraid I don't think Machiavelli is a Socratic in any way except the most accidental or non-essential parallel, if I can state that plainly.
Yeah, I guess if I could just respond to that and sort of to what Vicky was saying. I mean, the Platonic Socrates, no. And so I said pre-Platonic, Socratic. And then,
right.
but that's still not to say that one is free of coming up with the metaphysics that justifies the life. And even if Xenophon doesn't have the same as Plato, it does seem that he has one, and that it's not in keeping with Machiavelli's either. But my assertion is that it's the case that Machiavelli, is defending the life of knowing as the life that is the best life, without admitting that there is a difference between a best life and a less good life. He puts forward a framework wherein that which he is what is most needed. And what is most needed is someone who knows, who is a knower of the world as it is and as it can be. And therefore, he would indict philosophy as a thing in itself. He's with Cato. People come to him and say, I am a philosopher and this is the best way of life and I want to order a regime that somehow supportive of this. No, get out your sticks and beat them. Someone says, I'm someone who can really win the next war. He says, yeah, bring him in. If he can prove by giving reasons and defending his opinions without authority or force, then he's admitted. So I say the theoretical life under the cloak of the practical life, and within a scheme that it is needed.
Yes, David.
Well, I'm still somewhat at a loss as to what.
From the Holy Cross Crusaders.
I'm still somewhat at a loss then what Machiavelli's ultimate motivation would be on your understanding. If it's theoretical simply for the sake of the practical, if that's what you're saying, why should he care? Or is it the theoretical for the sake of the practical, for the sake in turn of the theoretical? Can you clarify that? In other words, why should he care about securing better military commanders in the future, or even restoring ancient political freedom? What would his ultimate motivation be, and how would this relate to his being a philosopher?
And are you? Could I ask you to put a point on that for why that question would have a salience toward Machiavelli or regarding Machiavelli when it wouldn't for any other philosopher? I mean, couldn't the same question be asked any and every philosopher, such that we would have to say, well, why did they write at all? I mean, and this is part of what I kind of have in mind by invoking Socrates. Socrates didn't. So what we have is different written accounts of him. And Machiavelli is existing in a time after there is a long tradition, Socratic tradition, and then permutations, many times over of that. But couldn't your question be asked, and couldn't one be as mystified in, beginning with Xenophon and going to Machiavelli, if it's the case that each of those philosophers think that their own good is what is most good. Now, it is the guiding thing for them. Now, if they don't, if they really, believe that selfless dedication to the common good is what one is about, then, well, it makes sense that they would devote themselves to writing books. But
what I have in mind is the thought that if a philosopher believes the greatest good, the best human life, for those who are capable of it, then there would be a harmony between his own pursuit of philosophy as his own greatest good and his wish to pass that good on to future generations of potential philosophers. Hence, no conflict. But if, as I understood you to be saying, yes, admit the philosophers or the schoolmasters only if they can make Rome more militarily effective, then that seems to be demoting philosophy to merely the service of non-philosophic ends. And if that's the case,
then it's harder for me to understand why Machiavelli would have an interest in perpetuating philosophy, even if it turns out that philosophy is the key to better military tactics in the future. Why should it matter?
No, I mean, my claim is that is the insistence. After Christianity, it is now a bad thing for philosophy to publicly say philosophy is the best way of life. It's bad for philosophy to do that. Why? Because it comes along with an entire understanding of the soul and of politics that is very conducive to all of the things that the Machiavelli thinks ultimately very hostile to theory things about Christianity. Therefore, publicly say this, but then also try to bring about a world in which it is the case that these knowers of the world are the ones who are most needed, and that they really are knowing what's true.
But you were speaking more public face than of Machiavelli's own belief, meaning he would, on your understanding, share the understanding of his predecessors that philosophy is in fact the best way of life. Only the public face of philosophy from now on will have to be its practical benefits, and if you can't make the case for its practical benefits, then better to be quiet entirely rather than continue Platonism.
Yes, though I would say that judgment that this needs to be the public face is not without theoretical implications itself. Okay, so if it's the case that there is a really fundamentally different judgment by Machiavelli on the nature of humanity and what it is and what it can be, then this is not just in the face of it a big metaphysical thing, but to begin with, it's a big thing. Human beings are different from what the ancients seem to have thought they were, at least in some respect. So it has some theoretical implications that could be huge.
Nathan.
Quickly as I can, three more passages. One, the dedicatory letter, where he says of all the things he has, the one he cares most about is knowledge of the actions of great men, but it's still knowledge. It's not his actions that he cares most about, it's his knowledge of actions. In the letter to Vittori of December 1513, he actually has two intermissions where he reads. One is in the middle of the vulgar part. He takes another time out, reading outdoors rather than in his house, reading love poetry and thinking about his own love. So just like the letter of 1514, there is this alternation of love and politics in it. It is, like the letter of 1514, a response to Vittori's account of how he spends his day, including sexual activity, not reading about it, and going to church, which Vittori mentions you never do. And then the last, more directly to turn the conversation's taken, violating our orders and turning also to the discourses, Book 3, Chapter 2, about simulating craziness, which I think is, in a way, the subject you've all been discussing. Do philosophers have to pretend to be crazy? Nor is it enough to say, I do not care for anything. I do not desire either honors or useful things. I wish to live quietly and without quarrel, for these excuses are heard and not accepted. Nor can men who have quality choose to abstain from political activity, even when they choose it truly and without any ambition, because it is not believed of them. So if they wish to abstain, they are not allowed by others to abstain. So he does seem to be saying, if we take this to be about philosophers, yes, philosophers don't want to quarrel and rule. They want to live quietly, but others will not allow that, and therefore we have to do it. I think that is at least roughly in line with Chris's suggestion that he's not denying that men of quality may wish to live quietly without quarrel, but in a world,
do it.
Yeah, in a world where so many are not good,
you'll be drawn into it. The effective truth of the philosophic life is that you're taken. So you better anticipate that possibility. Susan Shell.
Those who think, yes, Machiavelli is philosophic, those who have their doubts, for those who say, yes, he's philosophic, that his primary interest is knowing, do you also think he thought he had a good reason to put that first, or was it simply a taste on his part? That's the way he was made. Other people like other things. Did he have some cogent, conscious argument on behalf of that life? Or not? And sometimes I think I gathered from you, Chris, that you doubted that he did, or that there was some tension between his actual views as a thinker and his ability to justify putting thought first. Is that right, or do you think that he has a good reason to put thought first?
Yeah, I don't. He does not provide that reason, as far as I know. So he does not do that. If someone has a case for, for him providing that reason, I'd be totally open to it and happy to hear it. And because I do think that he does think that it is best for him. He does, I think, portray it as being something that overtakes him. It's a thing like love. It's a thing that happens to you. It's not a thing that you step back and you make a judgment with regarding, on the one hand. On the other hand, he does present these characters, who I say are representatives of the theoretical life, as having really these sort of existential choices. What am I going to do? Am I going to be a priest, or am I going to be a soldier? And it is true that the choice is put there, and he has the characters make the choice, and he doesn't provide the reasons. I mean, the reasons have to do with the human being and their nature. I guess I don't think he provides such reasons. I don't know that means he doesn't have them, but he doesn't provide them.
We have to stop. Thank you very much for coming. We'll resume our conference tomorrow. We're going to take up Machiavelli, the historian's Machiavelli, the moral Machiavelli, and the religious Machiavelli. And we'll start at 9 a.m. here. And there'll be, if you come a little early, you can have some coffee and stringent continental breakfast. So.